August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. Within hours, a body that hadn't agreed on anything for 50 years suddenly votes unanimously to condemn it. Within 4 months, it authorizes a war. The question isn't whether the UN worked. The question is, who was actually pulling the strings? On the 2nd of August, 1990, Iraqi forces led by Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The very same day, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 660 condemning the invasion. In 4 months of intense diplomacy, the Security Council passed a total of 12 resolutions, culminating in the passing of Resolution 678 that allowed the US-led coalition to expel Iraqi troops from Kuwait on the 28th of February 1991. What makes the sudden unity of the Security Council so extraordinary is that the Council had been paralyzed for almost 50 years during the Cold War rivalry between the US and the USSR. Some people see this unified Security Council response as renewal of the UN's collective security system, while for the revisionists, the negotiations in the Security Council demonstrated the United States' unilateral power, as the US instrumentalized the Council for its own national interests. But in today's rapidly changing geopolitical climate, does it still hold? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below, and let's get to the video. In today's video, we're answering to what extent the UN Security Council reached decisions regarding the actions for the Iraqi-Kuwait crisis multilaterally in comparison to the US lobbying the members of the Council and argued that both US pressure and multilateral deliberation simultaneously shaped the Council decisions. Before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the British delegation at the UN received instructions to address the escalating border dispute between the countries to the Security Council. However, neither the 5 permanent members of the Council nor the Secretary-General Pérez de Cuéllar showed much urgency in these efforts despite the active movement of the Iraqi troops towards the Kuwait border. Iraq was moving forward under the impression that the US could not afford to wage a war against Iraq because the George H.W. Bush administration, with the rest of the international community, had chosen not to intervene in the Iran-Iraq War of 1979, ignoring the nature of Saddam Hussein's regime, escalating tensions in the Gulf. After the Security Council failed to engage in preventive diplomacy, the Secretary-General began asserting institutional independence, making efforts to resolve the conflict diplomatically. In his memoirs, Pérez de Cuéllar wrote that he took high-risk steps of flying to Amman on the 31st of August 1990 and to Baghdad on the 13th of January 1991 to meet with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz and Saddam Hussein respectively, to persuade them to withdraw from Kuwait. On both missions, he acted alone and on his own initiative. He had asked no Security Council statement of support, as he believed that his chances of success would be higher if the Iraqi government saw him acting independently. This demonstrated that Pérez de Cuéllar exercised independent agency through diplomatic efforts and his attempts to avoid unilateralism, especially that of the US, to ensure that international actions remain within the UN framework. The Security Council's response to the invasion revealed both genuine deliberation inside the Council and the extent of US political maneuvering inside the Council, which was concealed by the intensive diplomacy and discussions. Let's start by delving into specific examples of how the US pressured the Security Council member states. Firstly, the US offered economic incentives to wavering members and applied diplomatic pressure on those who refused to vote accordingly on Resolution 678. This is seen in the examples of Yemen, China, and the USSR. In the case of Yemen, when it voted against Resolution 678, the US terminated its $70 million annual aid package to the country. In the case of the USSR, President George H.W. Bush secretly promised Mikhail Gorbachev an international conference on the Middle East during their summit in Helsinki in September 1990. However, once the military operation against Iraq began, the US sidelined the idea as it saw the conference as a distraction from the immediate goal of unconditional Iraqi withdrawal. These cases provide ample evidence for the US navigating the Security Council's response to the crisis. The Security Council records suggest that the Council did retain significant independence throughout the deliberations regarding the crisis. Despite economic threats from the US, Yemen argued that the sponsors of Resolution 678 acted in haste and failed to wait for the Secretary-General's reports on the effectiveness of economic measures against Iraq. In the case of the USSR, it strongly influenced the implementations of Resolution 678. During discussions in November 1990, the USSR focused specifically on building in a delay so that diplomatic leverage could be fully exploited before military action. As a result, Resolution 678 allowed for a grace period until January 15, 1991, during which Iraq could comply with past resolutions to avoid war. Based on these two positions, the relationship between the US and the UN Security Council is better understood as the US defining the boundaries and setting the agenda, while genuine deliberation occurred within the boundaries of the Security Council. This means that other Council members also significantly shaped key decisions. Arguing only for one position would provide an incomplete picture of how the UN Security Council worked during the Gulf crisis. Even though the US-led coalition successfully expelled the Iraqi troops from Kuwait, the outcomes that the crisis produced were contradictory. While the Security Council managed to demonstrate the successful operation of collective security, Pérez de Cuéllar expressed concerns about the ways the UN achieved the victory. For instance, he noted that the Security Council authorized a national and coalition-based force instead of enforcing the action as foreseen by Article 42 of the UN Charter, which empowers the UN Security Council to take military action. The Secretary-General deemed the use of the military force of the US-led coalition legally distinct from a true UN operation. However, it was unavoidable. In comparison to enforcing Article 42, which sets military action under the direct control of the UN. The Gulf War had set a precedent where the Security Council's authority could be borrowed by powerful states without the necessary institutional oversight. Pérez de Cuéllar's public concerns over how the UN Security Council handled the crisis unveiled the problems in the structure of the UN. Firstly, the authority of the Security Council is rooted in its perceived legitimacy, which creates a pull toward compliance among member states. The decision-making process for Resolution 678 lacked legitimacy because the Security Council came close to violating widely accepted principles of due process by allowing the US to direct a large unilateral military action. This demonstrates the first structural problem. The Security Council can adhere to the UN Charter while at the same time being manipulated to serve the interests of its most powerful members. Secondly, while the US finds the Security Council's endorsement valuable for legitimation, The Council itself remains selectively adherent to the UN Charter. The US understands that a Council mandate lends international legitimacy to its military power, making its actions more acceptable globally. The Security Council's success in 1990 and 1991 was the result of a necessary alignment of interests that remained a prerequisite for any effective action. The Iraqi-Kuwait crisis of 1990 and 1991 demonstrated that the UN Security Council was neither an autonomous multilateral actor nor an instrument of US power. Even when the US set the agenda and defined the boundaries, the Security Council still engaged in negotiation and deliberation that shaped key outcomes, as evidenced by Pérez de Cuéllar's independent Baghdad mission on the 13th of January and the Soviet negotiation of the 15th of January grace period. The Iraqi-Kuwait crisis case also proves a broader point that international organizations operate in the space between autonomy and great power influence. If you enjoyed this analysis, hit that like on the video and make sure to subscribe to the channel. You can find the sources used for this video in the description below. Don't forget to stay curious.